Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Hey, welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. Well, as we begin the podcast today, the government has lived to govern another day. The Carney government survived their motion last night, of course, on the budget by the narrowest of margins. That was not a surprise to an awful lot of us. I had predicted, of course, on the podcast earlier that the government probably would survive. But how they got there was rather interesting last night. And by the way, on that point, first and foremost, thank you to everybody who joined our live stream last night. We were live as the budget vote was happening, of course, in the House of Commons, full of a little drama, a little bit of intrigue, a little bit of showmanship. There was, well, the stuff I guess you would expect from the Canadian Parliament, and we weren't denied any of that stuff. But let's break some of this stuff down here and give us an idea as to just how we got there and what's going to happen going forward here. Okay, first and foremost, the final score, if we can put it that way, to continue the hockey metaphors. The final score was the Liberals, of course, with those who passed the budget, 170 to 168 by 2 votes. One of those votes was Green Party leader Elizabeth May, as we've talked about. As we did on the live stream last night, Elizabeth May had been meeting apparently with some of the government ministers over the last week and a half, 10 days or so, and was concerned about certain options to do with environmental issues, which she said were not covered in the budget. She was assured, we're told, that these climate goals that the government and previous Liberal governments had talked about were going to be addressed. And in fact, this is where some of the orchestration comes in here. In question period yesterday, the government, obviously, with the opposition and Poilievre and Carney and Poilievre were facing off, but there's so many questions allowed for each party. And the Liberals decided to give one of their questions, their allotted questions, to Green Party leader Elizabeth May, knowing full well what she was going to ask. And it had to do about the government's commitment to the Paris Accord and climate goals and things of this nature. And invariably, if an opposition member were to ask a question of that nature, the environment minister would probably rise in the House and answer it. Well, this time, Prime Minister Carney answered it. And this was all prearranged, clearly. And Carney basically assured Elizabeth May and the House that, yes, his government was committed to the goals of the Paris Accord, and that, yes, the environmental issues were going to be front and center, and a key part in how a lot of the stuff that he talked about in the budget is going to be implemented. Well, that satisfied Elizabeth May and said that, she has now decided to support the budget. So that was monumental, because it basically said, okay, all they needed was one more vote or abstentions. And the math here got a little tricky. But we knew that there was going to be a vote. They had that one in their pocket. So they were at a number right now that would have put them in pretty good state, but still not enough to pass it. So there was still some drama as the House started the vote last night. When it all broke down, of course, we mentioned 170 to 168 was the final tally. It came from abstentions. Now, we knew that was going to be a possibility, that there were going to be some people abstain. We had figured it was probably going to be on the NDP side. And to a point it was, but not maybe to the extent that we thought it was going to be. First of all, the Bloc all voted against that. But as we've mentioned, Mr. Blanchet and his Bloc caucus really don't seem to have a whole lot of attention, nor they give a damn about what happens in Canada. It's all about Quebec, Quebec, Quebec. Notwithstanding the fact that there were an awful lot of dollars and an awful lot of programs directed toward Quebec in the Carney budget, but that was not good enough for them. As you know, we talked about this on previous podcasts. They wanted more. They wanted more money from the federal government to be given to the province, and that sort of attitude is the sort of thing that kind of got us into the financial quagmire that the country's dealing with right now. So there was no going back and forth with the Bloc in that particular time, and it proved to be a moot point anyway. But let me talk about the abstentions, because that's fascinating. Okay, all the Liberals, of course, were in the House, and they all voted in favor of the budget. We mentioned Green Party leader Elizabeth May voted, but the 4 abstentions, 2 from the NDP and 2 from the Conservatives, which surprised an awful lot of people. And that's what I find fascinating about this. When we looked at exactly what was going to happen previous to this, of course, Pierre Poilievre was postulating in front of the microphones before the budget and saying that, his whole caucus was united against this budget, and they were all going to vote against this budget. Well, 2 of them did not, which I found rather interesting. One was MP Matt Généraux, who, of course, announced earlier, just after this whole thing with D'Outremont and others, the floor crossing, Généraux, of course, announced that he was going to retire from politics. He's not officially resigning or leaving until the spring, we're told. But he has not participated in any of the caucus meetings, apparently. And in the votes so far in this session, he has abstained. He hasn't been there for any of that stuff. And he was not voting last night. He abstained by his absence last night, did not vote, which maybe wasn't a surprise. But by the same token, Poilievre had suggested that his entire caucus was going to vote against it, and that was not the case. The other abstention on the Conservative side, somewhat of a surprise, is from MP Shannon Stubbs. Now, we're told that she could not vote for a medical issue. Apparently, she's recovering from, we're told, major jaw and chin surgery. And as her office said, apparently, she's recovering well, but her surgical team, has said lots of weeks of bed rest, no speaking, and limited movement to ensure a safe recovery. So that rendered her unable to vote. That's their story anyway. I'm not so sure. I mean, jaw surgery, voting remotely doesn't really take any speaking at all, but be that as it might. She didn't vote. And the fact that Poilievre didn't mention that I found interesting as he was talking about who was going to be voting and who was going to be supportive and not supportive in a situation like that. Some of my colleagues who are covering Parliament Hill were rather surprised by that. And some suggested that even Poilievre was kind of caught off guard by the fact that there were 2 abstentions on the Conservative side. If he didn't know about it, that indicates to an awful lot of people that maybe this guy just doesn't even have any idea what's going on in his own caucus, which really kind of substantiates the stories we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks, that he's lost the room, to use that old metaphor, that his caucus is not favorably in support of his leadership, and that they're doing what the hell they want to do at this particular situation. That does not bode well for a party that wants to win an election anytime soon, or to a guy like Poilievre who still has these delusions. I would suggest that he wants to be the prime minister of this country. But 2 Conservative abstentions, which was somewhat of a surprise. 2 NDP abstentions. And I want to talk about that for just a couple of seconds because we'll talk about the abstentions first of all, and then we're going to talk about what the interim leader had to say about this. One of them was Gord Johns, who's an NDP, who suggested that he went back. Of course, last week the Commons was dark, so they all went back to their constituencies. And Gord Johns said that he went and talked to local mayors, Indigenous leaders, who were unanimous in wanting to avoid an election. Said that, they didn't want to support this, but he did not want to go to the polls, didn't want an election. And he says, we're being the adult in the room right now, listening to our constituents. What he didn't mention, of course, is the fact that the NDP, his party, first of all, has been decimated. There's only 7 members in the caucus now. They have no money. They ran out of money. They're not getting very much in the way of donations these days. And for that matter, none of the political parties, neither the Liberals or the Conservatives or the Bloc for that matter, have been receiving their election rebates from the election this past spring. So there's no money in the account right now. They're probably on the overdraft. So they can't fight an election. They couldn't fight an election right now. And they know that, and I think everybody else knows that. So it's somewhat of a false bravado here that, we were being the adults in the room. There's no way they wanted to go to the polls. So, these 2 abstentions, which I'm sure were prearranged by the NDP, were to say, okay, we don't want this thing to fail, but we don't want to pretend that we're supporting this either. And that's some of the stuff that Don Davies, the interim NDP leader, talked about last night, saying that, they didn't come to us. They didn't say, well, what do you want to put in there? And again, I go back to what the Prime Minister has mentioned about this before, is there had to be a change of attitude about how governments run this country and how budgets are going to be designed. And it's common knowledge, and even Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, has suggested that the previous Trudeau administration spent way too much money on things that were not government priorities, and it's about time that's starting to rein in. So the NDP usually, especially under the agreement they had with the Trudeau government previously, were able to simply come up with their wish list and said, we want this, and if it's not in the budget, we're not going to vote for it. Well, 9 times out of 10, Trudeau acquiesced and said, okay, fine, we'll put those things in there. And that's why the government survived, of course. Well, that's not going to happen this year. The Prime Minister had already mentioned that he wasn't going to play politics that way. So the NDP, with, again, that false bravado, said, well, we're the principal party here. No, they aren't. They're the party that's fighting their own survival right now. So anyway, that was one. And the other was Laurie Idwat, who also abstained and said she didn't want to see it fail because apparently there was a lot of stuff in that budget that was going to benefit the people in her riding, but she didn't want to, be an NDP supporting a Liberal, which again is putting her own political self-interest, I guess, ahead of what's best for the party. I mean, if that had been a pivotal vote, what would she have done? Still voted against it and brought the government down, and then she'd have to go knocking on doors in her own riding and say, yeah, I know that program and the funding for that over there was in the budget, and I voted against it. So she didn't want to do that. Again, it's political self-interest that's at play here, and we need to kind of tell it what it is here. So those two abstentions and the two Conservative abstentions are the ones that actually got the budget to pass, which I find interesting because of the two Conservative abstentions. I mean, they really didn't need the NDP. I mean, the worst case scenario, even if all of the NDP members had voted against the budget, it would have been a tie vote. And as we've talked about in the past, the procedure is, in that case, the Speaker of the House will cast the deciding vote. And we also know that traditionally when that happens, and it has happened in the past, that the Speaker invariably will side with the government because the Speaker doesn't want to be someone who's going to cast a vote that's going to bring down a government. The fact that he's a Liberal and it's a Liberal government in power is not really a factor here. It just would have been done that way. And so as soon as those Conservative abstentions came in, we had a pretty good idea what was going to be happening here, and it was going to pass. What I found interesting about that, though, and again, I go back to the two Conservative abstentions, is invariably when it's all said and done and the vote is cast, and there was elation, of course, on the government side of the House, and backslapping and handshaking and a lot of festive howls and utes there. That's great. That's expected, of course, when something like this passes. But not a whole lot from the opposition. Don Davies, the NDP interim leader, did step in front of the media scrum after that outside the Commons and again tried to explain, rationalize, if that's the right word. I'm not so sure he was rationalizing anything with why the NDP voted or not voted in the fashion that they did. Pierre Poilievre was not to be seen or heard, which is rather unusual. I mean, this guy's never seen a microphone he didn't like. I think what he's starting to realize right now is that the microphones don't seem to like him very much because they're actually recording what he says, and that usually comes back to bite him. But there were no comments from Poilievre, and even as we do this podcast the next morning, we still have not heard official word from Poilievre on anything. So, and again, I don't know if the infighting that's going on in that caucus is part of the cause for this. I don't know if Poilievre's just feeling as if he doesn't have the confidence of his own folks in the caucus right now. I don't know what's going on there. And maybe he just knew that this thing was not going to pass. But, so the theater that was going on, including, by the way, a couple of well-known Conservatives who jumped in there, Scott Reid and Andrew Scheer. Scott Reid, of course, is the House leader for the Conservatives, and Scott Reid is the caucus chair. By the way, you may remember those two names. It's alleged that they're the two ones that burst into D'Entremont's office when he said he was going to cross the floor and berated him and threatened him and cajoled him and was supposedly pushed one of his staff members. So we know of them already. They both jumped in and said, well, they couldn't vote. I guess they were in their offices and they wanted to come onto the floor to officially record their vote. Well, by that time, the numbers have been counted and the vote was already lost. I don't know if Scheer did that simply to gain a couple of seconds of exposure on TV. Who knows what's going to happen? But it was an inconsequential vote anyway. But the fact that they did it to try to steal the spotlight, I guess, for a couple of seconds, it's just part of the theatrics that we see constantly in the House of Commons. So where do we go from here? Well, the government will carry on, of course. The budget has passed. Now, we're told that there are going to be some other votes to do with matters on the budget. So with a minority government, yes, this passes. Yes, this is going to be the policy that's going to move forward. But as each one of these programs is implemented, there's going to probably be votes within these particular aspects of the budget. And they're all going to be confidence votes. Any vote that, of course, includes large sums of money is, by definition, a confidence vote in the government. So there is still a possibility that somewhere down the road, this government could be defeated, and we could be finding ourselves in an election. Likely not going to happen for a few months, I would think. But it's there, okay? That's the sword of Damocles that's still hanging over the head of any minority government, and it's certainly hanging over this one. But there are some other factors here that I think have to be taken into consideration. And first of all, that's the popularity of the parties themselves and the popularity of the leaders, because those numbers and those attitudes about Canadian voters do matter in situations like this. And coincidentally, the morning after the budget vote was taken, Angus Reid released their latest survey right now. And the Liberals hold only a 2-point lead in advantage. Which party would you vote for? Which is not surprising. The economy is still in very serious trouble. And invariably, the government is always going to be blamed for that, even though this government's only been in play for about 7 months now. It happens, and they're aware of that, but they still have a lead, just not as big a lead as possible. The telling number, though, that I think is very, very relevant here is who would you like to see as prime minister? And well, we know the numbers for the last little while have been pretty strong about what the comparison between Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre. And this particular poll really bears that out, that Mark Carney right now has approval by about 52% of Canadians that want to see him as our prime minister and are very comfortable with him as our prime minister. 52%. Poilievre, who is the leader of the opposition party right now, well, somewhat lower, 34%. So that's 52 to 34%. So even though there's a relatively close race between the parties, and of course that has to take regional disparities in play too, Poilievre is just not liked by Canadian voters. That's all there is to it. As a matter of fact, his favourability, which is a mathematical equation that the pollsters use here, Poilievre's favourability is at the lowest point since he became leader of the party. In other words, this guy's trending way down. Mark Carney, despite some of the economic challenges that our government is facing these days, is trending upward still. And that, I think, is a strong indicator, if they did have an election and if they did pull the plug last night, as to the intentions that Canadian voters would have. And don't think that wasn't on the minds of the Conservatives. The possibility, and it was a real possibility, is if we did go to an election, there's a very real possibility that not only would the Liberals get reelected, but, with only, actually, in this particular case, only a couple of votes short of a majority government seats, they may actually have formed a majority government. Now, that may still be in the cards somewhere down the road. The conventional wisdom, if there is such a thing these days in politics, seems to be that, let's face it, when you're that close to a majority government, I'm not suggesting the Liberals wanted an election as from last night, but they were ready for one. My guess is that by springtime, by May, June, something like that, just around the time you're making your holiday plans for heading up to your cottage or whatever the case might be, we may well be into a federal election for one reason or another. And that seems to be a time, of course, when some of these policies that the Prime Minister has talked about could start to be implemented. They could start to see some of the fruits of those policies and maybe change some of those voters' attitudes. So, we're not out of the woods yet. Minority governments usually do not have a very long shelf life. And this one may still be something that come springtime we may be looking at. But that's well into the future at this stage. So we'll let things unfold as they might in Ottawa. Still lots of things to happen here. Economically, what's going to be happening, cost of living concerns, Poilievre's leadership review, which is coming up in January, which, as we said, I'm sure he's probably going to pass. The only thing is, 50.1, plus 1 is a pass, but is that strong enough? Is that a mandate? So there's going to be a lot of speculation about that and just how strong the support that Poilievre is going to have from with his own party. So more to come on all of this stuff. But the fact of the matter is it's still game on because of that vote last night. The Carney government was being chastised by some observers for not playing the politics game, like, going and talking to the leader of that party and what do we need to gain your support? Clearly they did with Elizabeth May, but apparently there wasn't a whole lot of discussion with the bloc, and certainly no discussion at all with Mr. Poilievre, although Carney and Poilievre did meet, as you may recall, just around the time that the budget was first delivered. But Mr. Poilievre, of course, has dug his heels in, and quite frankly, so did the Prime Minister. These are the policies, and I think the Prime Minister is pretty adamant about that, when you're confirmed that this is the direction in which we need to go, any vacillation from that is only going to make what they want to do here less effective. And I appreciate that in a leader that says, look, I have the courage of my convictions. This is what Canada needs. And according to the polling that we're seeing right now, most Canadians tend to agree with that. And that's something that Poilievre and the opposition parties are going to have to take into consideration. So an eventful night, a dramatic night last night, and it's not business as usual by any stretch of the imagination, but it's time to get down to work. And we'll see just how our MPs are going to do that and the kind of things that are going to happen. The strong message, and I think they heard that last week when they all went back to their constituencies, is quit being idiots, quit fooling around, and start cooperating and get to work. Whether you're a Conservative, whether you're a Bloc, whether you're an NDP, whether you're a Liberal, whatever the case might be, they're looking for teamwork here to try to get Canada moving forward in the right direction and stop the petty politics. As to whether or not they heard that is yet to be determined. We'll certainly talk about that on the podcast. That's it for this edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast. Thanks for being with us. If you're on YouTube, please hit that notification bell and pass the word on. Thank you to everybody, as we mentioned, first of all, for joining us on the live stream talking about the budget vote. And thanks to the many people that subscribed. Even last night, we got quite a number of new folks jumping on board. That's greatly appreciated. Your support is what helps us to continue to do the work that we're doing here on the podcast. Thanks to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.